Hi guys, I'm Philip J. White and this is the Conscious Society YouTube channel. Today we have Gregg Braden joining us as a guest on the program. If you're not familiar with Gregg, he has been a writer and a public speaker for many years now and basically focuses on the topics of science and spirituality and how those two areas can be bridged in the modern day world, and also how that can be translated into the real world. So welcome to the program, Gregg.
Philip, it's great to hear your voice. I am thrilled to be on the program today. I'm going to say to all of our listeners, happy 2016. I'm excited about this new year, and I'll tell you what, the last year went by so fast. If this year is any indication, the first month is any indication, we're in for a big, big year.
It does seem to be speeding up. I don't know if it's because I'm getting older or because time is literally speeding up, but I think with the explosion of information that is basically infiltrating the collective consciousness of humanity, things really do feel like it is speeding up because everything's moving so quick. There's so much new information that is driving the awakening that humanity is going through.
I think so, Philip. Everyone perceives it differently. But what I'll say is the best minds of our time are telling us that we are, in fact, going through what they call, we're living a time of extremes. So the extremes don't have to mean only bad things are happening or even good things, for that matter. But big things, big changes in the world around us. And because we can no longer separate the big world out there from what's happening in our everyday lives, it means we're all going through big changes in our lives, and it's happening with relationships, with careers, with health, with finances and economics. It shows up in a lot of different ways, but I think it's a hallmark of the cycles of time that we now find ourselves in, and the fact that we are living the convergence of three major cycles that you simply do not hear about in mainstream media from this perspective. We are living the convergence of a cycle of climate change, a cycle of economic change, and a cycle of conflict. And when we talk about these cycles in the Western perspective, mainstream media simply, there's a reluctance, in some cases a resistance, to even talk about these cycles. But in other parts of the world and other traditions, they're very common. They're commonly known. They're mathematically driven, and that means we can know when the cycles begin, when they end, and what to expect. So I think that's a long answer to a short comment, but I'm going to just say that to kind of lay the foundation for everything that we talk about today.
No, it's really I guess inspiring to hear somebody who in the New Age or spiritual community talk about some of these systemic and geopolitical and political and economic extremes, as you called them, instead of just focusing on that personal bubble. And it really, 2016 really has started off with a bang in terms of the volatility in the stock markets and also the increasing escalation of Middle East, etc. So these cycles, I'd love to hear you further elaborate on them.
Well, the nature of the cycles themselves, the cycles are based on natural rhythms that govern everything from the orbits of the planets around the sun to electrons around the nucleus of an atom to when life begins and when life ends. These are all governed by natural processes, and our ancestors were very familiar with this. They lived close to the earth, and they were very familiar with certainly the cosmic cycles and how our everyday lives fit into the cosmic cycles. In the Western traditions, science is only about 300 years old. It's a relatively young way of looking at the world, and when science came along, they threw out a lot of those the indigenous perspectives, threw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater. We've heard that before. So science is not so willing to look at things in terms of cycles. So when we do this, the value of looking at a cycle A cycle has a beginning, it has an end, and between the end of one cycle and the beginning of the next, there's a time that neither one exists. It's called a choice point. It's actually a term that's used in physics, choice point. And the choice point is a place where the deck is stacked in our favor in terms of making change. If we want to change the energy of a cycle that has just completed, whether it's a personal cycle in our own lives of betrayal and loss and hurt, or if it's a cycle of health that's not working well, or on a global level, if it's a cycle of conflict, the principles are all the same. At a choice point, that's when it's easiest to change the energy as we go into that new cycle. So the beauty of knowing that, the value of knowing this, is when we recognize that we are, in fact, living a cycle of climate change. It is very well known in scientific circles. They're called Milankovitch cycles. They're based on the tilt, the angle, the wobble of our planet. The last time this happened was about 5,000 years ago. The cycles are intense, they're brief, and it's what comes after the cycle that can be the biggest problem. Everyone's focused on warming. We have gone through a minor warming of the Earth, right on schedule where it should be in the cycles. If we did not have the warming, I would have been concerned, because I would say, what's wrong? The cycle says it should be here. And it's the cooling that comes after the warming that is the big problem for civilizations in the past. And we're not hearing about that today. We're not looking at it. We're stuck on this idea of the carbon dioxide induced change. And because of that, and I want to be really clear about this, Philip, this isn't about making anyone right or wrong. That's not why I'm sharing this information. How can we be resilient to a change unless we are honest with ourselves about that change? And climate change is a perfect example. The economic cycles. There was an economist in the last century, Kondratiev was his name, and he identified anyone listening to this program that studied economics has heard his name before. Kondratiev identified these large economic cycles and then the smaller segments that he called seasons, literally the spring, summer, the fall, and the winter season of the economic cycles. Right now, early 2016, we are just coming out of what is called the economic winter, a cycle of deflation, where everything loses value, and that's exactly what's happening in the world today. If you know you're in that cycle, you can prepare for that, and you think about savings and money and retirement and putting your kids to school. You think about it a little bit differently. But if you try to create money in the same way that we did 10 and 15 years ago, in a deflationary cycle, it's not going to work, and that's where people get hurt. The cycles of conflict. Kondratiev also talked to us about 56-year cycles of conflict and 17-year cycles of conflict. And we are precisely on schedule in a cycle of conflict that started ramping up in the year 2014. It peaks in the year 2017. And all you have to do is look into the world and see what's going on. No one needs to tell us we're in a cycle. It's obvious. Something is happening here. But the point of all of this is if you do not understand how the cycles work, and this is what one facet of my work is about our relationship to these cycles. That's only one facet. If we don't understand these cycles, when we see the change, we think the world is broken. We think everything's coming apart at the seams. My mom is a perfect example. My mom, she watches the news and she just thinks, there's no hope. She says, everybody's crazy and the world's just falling apart. And it's easy to think that until we step back and look at the rhythms. And I want to be very, very clear about this. When we find ourselves in a cycle, these cycles, they don't say that something must happen. It doesn't say that we must have war or that we must have an economic collapse. It says that we are vulnerable, we are susceptible to tremendous amounts of change when we are witnessing these cycles. So the reason I'm saying this is what makes today so very different. Our experts are telling us we're living in a time of extremes. And I want to back that up with something solid. The extremes are the result of not one, or two, but three cycles converging in the same period of time. Climate, economy, and conflict are all converging right now. So what that means is that the world is changing, and it means our lives are changing. And while we cannot as individuals necessarily do anything about the big world, we feel powerless to change a relationship between, Russia and the United States or China and Japan or something like that. We have tremendous ability to determine how we respond to these cycles of change. The better we know ourselves, the better equipped we are to embrace the change in a healthy way. And that is the focus of my work as well. What did our ancestors know about embracing change that we've either forgotten or maybe we never knew? What does science tell us about the human body and the aspects of ourselves that we're only beginning to understand that help us to embrace this change in a really healthy way? So all of a sudden, all of this comes together. It's the best science of the 21st century. It's the wisdom of 5,000 years of our ancestors and indigenous traditions. It's the real world out there that we see every day of our lives, all coming together in a way that is forcing us to think and live differently and to find new and sustainable ways of thinking and living. So that is the essence of what this work is all about. 2016, actually, Philip, 2016 is the 30th anniversary from the very first talk that I gave on these topics in 1986 in the city of Denver, Colorado, in the United States. So for 30 years, I've been working with other researchers and scholars and scientists and spiritual leaders to bring the best wisdom to bear upon the world and our lives and what's happening in our lives. We've had the opportunity to share what I've just said to you. We just shared with the United Nations. My dear friend, Dr. Bruce Lipton, I think you've had on this program before. And he and I were invited to the United Nations in New York last fall to share precisely this kind of information. What are the patterns? What can we expect? And how can we become resilient to this changing world so that we thrive in the transformation, so that we don't succumb to the changes out of fear. So, again, it's a long answer to a short comment, but it really helps to flesh out what we're talking about here.
You mentioned that the choice point and that the convergence of those three cycles are happening right now. So is this the choice point for those three cycles on a macro scale?
It is a part of a choice point. I think our listeners may remember a couple of years ago there was a big buzz about the year 2012 and indigenous traditions and cycles of time, 5,125 years long. Well, what a lot of the media didn't say is that 5,125-year cycle, between the time it ends and when the next cycle begins, there is a buffer where neither cycle exists. And that buffer is a global choice point. So, yes, we are living a global choice point, and within that, we're seeing the convergence of these cycles that are giving us the reason to think and live differently. So, if you talk to mainstream media, watch the 6 o'clock news, you're in Australia, so Sky News, or CNN or BBC World or whatever it is, there's a tendency, not always, but generally, there's a tendency. They say, if we can just fix this one thing, if we can just fix the debt, then the economies are going to be okay. Or if we can just drive smaller cars and change the kinds of light bulbs we use, we're going to be able to curb climate change. And if we can just get these countries to think differently, we're going to avoid these wars. They're looking at individual pieces of a bigger pie. And it's difficult when you look at one piece at a time to see the systemic shift that our world is going through. But when we step back, Philip, and look at the big picture, and when we honor the science shows us that civilization has been through these big changes before, and it goes back long before the times that we're teaching in our public classrooms right now. Public classrooms in the West, textbooks are telling us that civilization began about 5,000 years ago, interestingly. right at the time the last cycles occurred. But the archaeology and the peer-reviewed science is showing us that advanced technological civilizations go back much further than that into the last ice age, about 13,000 years ago, and that we, in fact, are living a third cycle of these shifts. 5,000 years ago, one of these cycles began, 10,000 years another one, and 15,000 years another one. Climate change is always a hallmark in the cycles, and it forces people to think and live differently because we have to choose, how do we share resources that are disappearing and becoming scarce and disappearing? How do we work together to solve the problems, or do we work together, or do we choose conflict instead of cooperation? We are not the first cycle of civilization that's had to make these choices. We are the first one that's recognized in the mainstream. So for me, this is the value of spending time in some of the most isolated and remote, pristine places remaining on the earth today, in the monasteries and the nunneries, the archaeological sites, and with the indigenous people that have a memory and have the records of these previous cycles, so that we can learn from our past and maybe not make some of the mistakes again today. And I think that's worthwhile doing, and I think it's a worthwhile pursuit.
It's certainly an exciting time. It's very much a duality. I see as you mentioned, the extremes, the highs and the lows. There is a planetary awakening happening throughout humanity, and we really seem to be getting towards a tipping point. And that tipping point leads to more of a collective acceptance or consensus around, I guess, two primary areas: the spiritual aspect of life as well as the systemic aspect of life. And through my research, I've noticed that sometimes people can only sort of become conscious of either side of that coin, that science, that spirit, or that systemic, that spirit, depending on how you want to look at the material versus the spirit and how they interrelate. And but some people get sort of get the whole picture, and once you sort of see it from that holistic point of view, there is a lot of hope that naturally generates through that process.
There is, and this is where the science, in many respects, I'm just going to preface by saying I'm a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist. My degree's in the earth sciences and geology. I've got a strong background in ocean science, life sciences, marine biology, chemistry and physics, and computer science. So they all work together to help me to understand from a scientific perspective how our world works, how we work, how we relate to the world. But I have to say, Philip, as good as science is, it's incomplete. Science doesn't have all the answers. And in many respects, science today has been hijacked. It's been hijacked by corporations. It's been hijacked by the political process. It's been hijacked by religion. And because of that, what I mean by that is what science has discovered. We ask science to tell us the truth about us and our world. And science does that. Sometimes we don't like the answer. If it doesn't fit our agenda, if it doesn't fit the religious agenda, or the corporate agenda, or the political agenda. So our listeners have to be really, really discerning when we listen to information and where that information comes from. Because if it is not what is called peer-reviewed, P-E-E-R, peer-reviewed information, then a lot of it is just hearsay. So when you go to the peer-reviewed science, and this is the science that has the research that's been circulated among other scientists for a period of months, sometimes years. Other scientists have the opportunity to poke holes in the theories and to point out what is true and what's not true. And when that science is actually published in a peer-reviewed document, a peer-reviewed journal, you can be pretty sure that it's telling you the truth about what's happening in the world. That's very different from a scientist that just writes an opinion, puts it on the internet, and all of a sudden everybody on the internet is saying, this scientist says this, or, this scientist says that. So the science is giving us the reasons to think and live differently if we are willing to embrace what science has told us. Now, I know you've had other scientists on here. You mentioned Fred Alan Wolf. I've worked with before. Amit Goswami. I've had the honor. I spoke with him in London a few months ago. He's a brilliant man. And these are the scientists that are really digging for the deepest truths of our existence, finding ways to apply those truths in our everyday lives. One of those, Philip, that I think is the basis for everything we're talking about, Charles Darwin in 1859 led us to believe that nature, the fundamental law of nature, is based on conflict and primarily on conflict. The best science of the 21st century, competition and conflict, that's what I wanted to say. It's based on competition and conflict. The best science of the 21st century is now telling us in peer-reviewed journals that nature is not based upon competition and conflict. It's based on cooperation and what's called mutual aid. And it doesn't deny that conflict exists. We all see that in nature. What it says is the more conflict that we see, the further we have strayed from the truest law of nature, which is cooperation and mutual aid. So the value of that, for me, is in our time of extremes, where we're seeing things happen that we've never seen before. In the 21st century, we're trying to solve those problems with 19th and 20th century thinking based on those old ideas, and it's not working, and we all see that. So that's okay. Let the old ideas go and embrace the new science. The new science says that cooperation is the way to go. And I think in a globalized world where we all share the problems, the cooperation will become the hallmark for the way that we go about solving these problems. And I think you're seeing it play out on the global stage between nations, as well as locally between families and communities. And I think it's one of the hallmarks of this new era that we're moving into right now is the world of cooperation.
I've written extensively about this in terms of how competition dominates our programs, our systems at the moment through the materialists or the consumerists, even, I guess, that individualistic sort of ideological framework that drives human behavior both individually and collectively. And that those systems create scarcity. And instead, we should be looking towards cooperative measures to create abundance. And there are several systems that have been designed to actually ensure that we live an abundant life, both in resources and abundance of emotional, psychological, and spiritual health as well. Now, I also want to just quickly go back to something else you said before about the hijacking of science, which is something else I've written quite extensively about. And I've noticed that philosophical materialism has also been an ideology that has hijacked science, and the materialist, matter-based, that's all that there is to reality, has been the default mechanism for the interpretation of scientific evidence that's emerged over the last century. But things really are changing. I spoke to Rupert Sheldrake and Dean Braden as well. They were both guests on the program, and they really look at the quantum physical paradigm or model and how that can be united with classical physics. And I know that you've written extensively about that.
I would love to, but I just want to go back just about a half a step, and I want to clarify to our listeners, because if someone were listening to this and they've never heard this conversation before, I want to be very clear what I mean when I talk about competition and cooperation. When we talk about the competition in terms of systems, we're talking about what is called violent competition. And that is defined as where an individual or a group benefits at the expense or the suffering of another. So that's the kind of competition we're talking about. We're not saying that a friendly game of soccer or a game of chess. I want to make very, very clear what we're talking about, the kind of competition where when someone benefits at someone else's expense, that is the kind of competition that's destructive. Darwin told us that was the fundamental rule of nature. Science, the best science now of the 21st century, is telling us that is simply not true. So I just want to be clear on that.
Well, that's the capitalist structure right there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think that we are coming full circle with this in terms of the science. The changes in the world are pushing us to understand ourselves and our relationship to the world in a more holistic way. So it's interesting to me because, as I mentioned, science is good. Science can only tell us the nuts and the bolts of how something works. Science cannot necessarily tell us how to apply that knowledge in our lives. So, for example, quantum physics. Before quantum physics came around, we were taught, and still in many classrooms today, we're taught that everything is separate from everything else. We're separate from our bodies, we're separate from the world, that we have little, if any, influence over the world around us. And that kind of thinking leads to a way of living where there's an indifference. We don't think about how our actions could affect anyone else. Why should we? Because we were taught that we are separate from everything else. Quantum physics now is telling us that we are all connected. We're deeply connected, entangled with ourselves, with one another, with the earth. And that leads to a very different kind of thinking. And with that thinking comes a sense of responsibility. Because we're connected, how do my actions affect other people? How do my actions affect the world around me? And this is the first generation in the modern world that has been asked to think this way, although indigenous people, although they didn't use science, they had this spiritual understanding. They said, of course, everything's connected. And they lived the truth of that connection for hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of years. So they didn't have to spend 3 centuries trying to prove whether or not everything is connected. They said, of course, everything's connected. And they spent their time developing the ways to use that connection in a healthy way. So what we see now is the world is changing. And those old ideas of separation are breaking down. They're not working anymore, and they're not solving the problems. We're trying to solve the problems with a way of thinking, and the solutions aren't working. So it is actually a catalyst to bring these two worlds together, these two great ways of knowing, the best science of the 21st century and the wisdom of 5,000 years and more of our ancestors, weaving them together into a wisdom that is more than either science or spirituality could be by itself. As I mentioned, my belief is science doesn't have all the answers. Spirituality doesn't have all the answers. Both of them work in some respect in some aspects of our lives. But when we marry them together, we give ourselves the benefit of a wisdom that, to the best of my knowledge, has never existed in recorded human history. And that, I believe, gives us the evolutionary edge to move forward in our time of extremes, to thrive, not to survive, thrive in our time of extremes so that we can embrace the change in a healthy way. And that's why I think it's so important to have these conversations. So, Philip, I really appreciate this venue so that we can even have this conversation.
Absolutely, and I very much agree in terms of incorporating some of the ancient and tribal wisdom that really does permeate a lot of different cultures and some of those civilizations from the past, and incorporate them into our modern day framework where we do have a lot of beautiful and valuable technology and concepts, and we really have become to a point where we've created a uniting global culture. The internet, the technology, and the way that we've been able to share information instantaneously across our planet. And I'm calling you from Australia, and you're over in the US, and this has just created an abundance of information, which we have to sift through. There is propaganda and false information in any sort of media or body of knowledge that you can go into. But this really has given us the opportunity as a species for what I consider the first time in our known history to be able to consciously choose together the way we move forward into our future. And I'm hoping that we do choose a pathway that is in benefit to all of our fellow man, not just some of them.
I like the way you think, Philip. I'm right there with you. I couldn't have said it better myself. We're living a choice point. It's a global choice point, personal choice point. And I think it's a time, it's not about blind faith, because the best science of our time is giving us the reasons to think differently. You know, one of the really good pieces of news that I'd love to share with my audiences, we are living this time of extremes, and we already have all the solutions for all the big problems, the technological solutions. We already have all the food to feed every mountain, every child, every woman, every man on the face of the earth. And the United Nations says that food security, we have food security for at least the next years or so. So the lack of food is not the reason that our global family is going to bed hungry tonight. It's because of the thinking. It has not yet become a priority to get that food to the people that need it. We already have the technology to create electricity and bring it into the home of every family that wants it, with no fossil fuels, with zero greenhouse gases. That technology has existed for over 60 years. We've already had it. We already have the knowledge to reverse disease and trigger the healing in every organ of the human body, even the organs that we were told could not heal: spinal cord tissue, brain tissue, and heart tissue, and pancreatic tissue. It's done. It's been documented. But we have to give ourselves the environment to do that. We already know how to create an economy based on cooperation and sharing rather than competition and scarcity. We already know it, and it's already starting. So, you know, when I share those facts with our audience, we already have these big solutions. People ask, the question is, if we have those solutions, why don't we see them? You know, where are they now? And I think you nailed it, Philip. The biggest crisis that we face, it's a crisis in thinking. Because before we can embrace the science, before we can embrace the wisdom of our ancestors, before we can embrace the benefit of what we've already created, we have to make room for these things in our lives. And we have to make it a priority to help one another in our time of extremes. And I think that is perhaps the biggest crisis that we face today. And one of the ways of going about doing that is through sharing knowledge, and that's precisely what we're doing right now. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share this in the brief format that we have today.
Yeah, absolutely. We really do have the power. The people have the power. There are some oligarchical power structures that are in the old way of thinking, the old paradigms. They've created their mechanisms for power, and they're holding on to that with dear life through their corporate power structures and monopolies and whatnot. But really, it comes down to the people sharing the right information, building the collective awareness around exactly what you mentioned there, all those areas: philosophy, technology, science, economy. There's a whole gamut of systemic and social dysfunctions that we really do need to heal. And there needs to be a lot of compassion and love and good vibrations injected into those areas of life by as many people as possible to really start implementing what you mentioned, all these beautiful solutions that, and from all these progressive and alternative mindsets and people that are really leading the charge in this transition or transformation to an abundant and cooperative and peaceful era for humanity.
Well, I can't think of a more exciting time to be here. And I was on a plane from one city to another here in the States, and I sat next to a man, he's a military man, and he and his wife, they just got married, and he said that they were not going to have any children. And I asked him, I said, why are you not having children? And he said, Why would I want to bring a child into this world in the condition that it is right now? And I asked him another question. I said, why would you deny a child the opportunity to make a contribution, to make a powerful contribution in a world that is ripe for change right now? Your child might be the one that has the big idea that leads everyone in just the right direction. And we had this conversation for 3 hours on the plane. And when we went to the baggage claim to pick up our bags, he was in a big hurry. I said, where are you going? And he said, are you kidding? I'm going to go home and make a baby with my wife. I said, good. You know, we did our job. We did a good job. But it's a simple story about a belief that many people have that the world it's not a good place to raise children right now. And I think to be a child coming into this world where everything is up for grabs. You know, all of the old ideas are falling away, and that means it's ripe for the new ideas. What a powerful opportunity for one soul to make a huge difference, and we never know which one that's going to be. So I'm going to leave our listeners with that thought today. And just again, my deepest gratitude to you, Philip, for the opportunity to work together, and I look forward to the next time. I don't have to have a new book in order to have these conversations. I look forward to continuing this conversation at another time.
I'm sure we could talk for the next hour or two and not bore ourselves or the audience. So I really appreciate you joining me, Gregg. Is there, do you want to plug your website, your latest book, and your upcoming book?
Sure. If people are interested, as I mentioned, this is the 30th year that I've done this work in one form or another. We have a number of books out there. The website, www.Gregg, Braden, and that's Gregg, two G's, Braden, BRADEN.com. If you go to the events section, you can see where I am in the world, and if you go to the book section, you can take your pick of all the books. Each book I've written covers one facet of us and our relationship to ourselves and the world. So not every book is about the big picture. Some of them are about relationships. Some of them are about healing. Some of them are about our relationship to time and the cycles of relationships in our lives. So I'd like people just to some video clips there to help to understand that. You can peruse the website, and I hope you enjoy it. 16, and I look forward to the next time here, Philip.
Well, it was such a refreshing conversation. I find that many people in the New Age community like to keep their heads in the sand around some of the darkness that permeates our world, but we are in a yin-yang duality. We need to embrace all layers of truth, and you really have reflected the hope that really exists in humanity to disconnect from the mainstream propaganda narratives and really investigate some of the more pure truths that are really starting to resonate and radiate with so many people across the world, across cultures, across age, across sex, across every single person that lives in this glorious time. So thank you, Gregg. I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate it as well. I look forward to the next time. Take good care.